thing.
New details tonight in the death of infamous D.C. cocaine kingpin Rayful Edmond. He died at the age of 60 months after he was released from prison.
Edmond's drug operation profited hundreds of millions of dollars at the height of the crack epidemic back in the 1980s. Fox 5's Bob Barnard is live in Northwest tonight with more. Bob?
There are no confirmed details about his death, but numerous reports indicate Rayful Edmond died suddenly of a heart attack at the halfway house where he was living in Miami.
I'm back, better than ever.
This is the most recent and only video of Rayful Edmond we've seen since his release from a federal prison last summer, captured on camera at an airport just after his release and shared on social media.
My first thought was, man, I hope he wasn't assassinated. But as it turns out, he apparently died a natural death. And anybody who's been in prison long enough eating prison food, it doesn't take much to imagine how that can happen.
Billy Murphy is one of the attorneys who represented Rayful Edmond over the years. Here was Murphy outside D.C.'s federal courthouse in September 1990, the day Edmond was sentenced to life in prison.
This kid was a genius. There was no question about it. I sat with him every day during a very long trial. What would have happened to him had he instead of having two parents who trained him to be a drug dealer? From the earliest of ages, I might tell you, if he had had two parents who were successful business people or business executives who trained him in the right direction.
Rayful Edmond spent 35 years in prison, arrested at age 24, and convicted of running a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy, dealing crack cocaine on the streets of D.C., leading to multiple murders as well. Then U.S. Attorney Jay Stevens.
I think Rayful Edmond has been held accountable for the human destruction and tragedy that he has brought to this city and to the lives of thousands of young people who live in this community.
But Rayful Edmond would continue running his enterprise from inside prison, later becoming an informant, leading to the arrests of nearly a dozen of his former cohorts.
I don't think I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison. I think I'm going to go home one day soon.
You think your appeal will be successful?
Yes, I hope and pray that it will.
Turns out his prayers were answered. Despite being sentenced to life in prison, Edmond was released into the community last summer, his sudden death coming just 5 months later. And there's no word on any services. Rayful Edmond is survived by his mother, who served time in prison as part of that conspiracy, and at least one sister. Angie?
It's been about 24 hours now since we learned a significant figure in modern D.C. history died.
Yeah, but he wasn't a politician, and he wasn't a sports star. Rayful Edmond was a notorious drug kingpin.
He thrived during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which spiked the city's murder rate so high, D.C. became known as the murder capital of the nation. Edmond spent 35 years in prison. He was released 4 months ago to a halfway house in Miami. At the time of his release, News 4's Paul Wagner brought us this report on Edmond's impact on D.C.
The release from prison came as a bit of a surprise. Edmond is now out in part because in the 90s, he cooperated with the government after the FBI learned he was making large drug deals with the Colombia cartel from his federal prison cell in Pennsylvania. In 1994, he flipped and became a snitch. Court records show for the next 20 years, Edmond provided information to the feds that led to the convictions of at least 100 people. Here in D.C. during the late 80s, he ran his cocaine operation from a house in Northeast where a young police recruit successfully infiltrated the gang. In 2019, News 4's Jackie Benson spoke with the undercover officer, now retired.
I was in there for like 3 days and got asked, did I want to do undercover work?
The undercover was known to the gang as Jimmy, who remembers cocaine shipments being delivered by the truckload.
And a guy sitting on the back with a Uzi, with 2 Uzis.
At one point, Edmond became close with some of Georgetown University's top basketball players, and Coach John Thompson met with Edmond and asked him to leave his players alone.
Rayful respected that because Rayful was a big basketball fan.
The crack epidemic had the district in a vice grip for years, with countless murders linked to it. In the district, Paul Wagner, News 4.
Now, the News 4 I-Team's Tracee Wilkins joins us in studio here now. Tracee, you grew up here in Washington, D.C. So for people who are more recent transplants to this area, or even younger people, can you sort of break down the impact that Rayful Edmond had on our area even more?
Well, so according to the prosecutors, he was operating some 60% of the crack cocaine that was moving throughout the District of Columbia. That is a large amount of drugs coming into this small city, right? And he had, at the time of his arrest, one of the most profitable drug operations in the nation, right? So what that looked like here was, I was raised in Prince George's County. My maternal grandmother lived in Northeast DC, 42nd and Benning Road, just a couple of blocks up from Minnesota Avenue and near the shrimp boat. And I remember growing up and feeling just a feeling of safety in that community, being able to play and you know, do whatever there. And I also remember the change in 86, 87, 88, when the community just was different. Apartment complexes where working people lived became crack houses, you know, and the feeling of the community shifted. And I think that happened throughout the district and a lot of places where Black people lived in DC, that there was just this, it felt like living in a war zone, and all of the murders and all of the shooting and all of the things that were happening. And so it was a very difficult time. And I think that if you talk to these folks who have survived, because Edmond didn't do this alone. He had a network of dealers who he operated with, and there were a lot of people who were making money off of that operation. They lost, in addition to, for those who survived, a lot of time, right? Because of the war on drugs and these extended years that people spent in prison, and how that's impacted this generation, in addition to the addiction, the people who died, the people who were incarcerated. So many kids and grandkids have been left without loved ones. So that is the legacy, right? And Edmond apologized for the decisions he made when he was, you know, in his early 20s. He went to prison like 22, 23.
Yeah, well, you talk about his age. I want to bring up, in this morning's news meeting, you were talking about America's fascination with sort of, you know, gangsters, and the impact that he had on the area, as you mentioned. I mean, he died at the age of about 60, and the impact that he had in such a short amount of time in his youth in the city.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we glorify crime and the underworld, but we tend to do that, right? That's just an American thing, right? But in this instance, we are living in the after effects of how all of these decisions that these young men made have impacted the city. A lot of them who are now trying to atone for what they did then, and you know, and if they had a second chance, would have made a different decision. There was an insane amount of money to be made, and a lot of people who wanted a part in that, and we are still dealing with the repercussions. So for people who weren't here to see DC before Edmond, DC after Edmond, it's two different cities in a lot of ways. And it was always hard drugs. We always had heroin. There was always a market. This was just much more controlled and much more organized than we've seen before.
You know, its reach, being named the drug capital of the U.S. I mean, I didn't grow up here, but we heard about it in Indiana, and it was like, I don't know if we want to go to Washington, D.C. It's a scary place. So, I mean, when you think about even that.
The reach
you
it
know,
had.
Yeah, the reach.
Yeah,
so.
But folks are working to turn that around. And again, including a lot of the folks who worked with him are also trying to make that better and heal these communities that have been devastated.
Tracee, thank you for your insight.
Thank you.